Your FastMCP server works locally, but production-grade OAuth means no hard-coded secrets and proper provider configuration. So how do you bridge that gap cleanly? We'll show the exact pattern from the docs, environment variables for development simplicity, while demonstrating how FastMCP tool keeps your business logic separate from authentication. You'll see the minimal setup that automatically loads credentials from environment variables, then learn which explicit parameters like cliented, client secret, and required scopes become mandatory when configuring providers like Auth0 provider or WorkOS provider for production, all while the tool decorator handles endpoint exposure without security logic leaks. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. Hash authentication, automatically configured from environment. MCP equals FastMCP, name equals my server. @MCP, tool. Def protected tool, data, SDR. This tool is now protected by OAuth. Return F processed, data. If name equals main. MCP, run transport equals HTTP, port equals 8000. This demonstrates environment-based authentication configuration for exposing protected RPC endpoints, where the FastMCP tool decorator cleanly separates tool registration from security implementation. The minimal example shows FastMCP automatically loading credentials from environment variables, ideal for development, while production deployments require explicit provider configuration with parameters like cliented, client secret, and base URL. The key distinction is that authentication remains entirely configurable at the server level, with no security logic embedded in the tools themselves. The pattern works by delegating authentication to the FastMCP server instance, which validates all requests against a configured OAuth OIDC provider before dispatching to decorated tools. In development, environment variables handle this configuration transparently, while production requires explicit providers, like Auth0 provider or WorkOS provider, with mandatory parameters such as config URL for Auth0 or Authkit domain for WorkOS. This design ensures tools remain pure business logic, with security policies, token validation, and redirect handling managed centrally by the server. This approach matters because it eliminates the need to modify tool implementations when authentication requirements change, while still enforcing strict security policies. The environment-based setup simplifies development, while production deployments gain explicit control over scopes, token management, and provider-specific parameters. The trade-off is minimal upfront configuration for maximum flexibility, making it ideal for scenarios where you need to expose tools securely without embedding auth logic in each endpoint. Let's break it down line by line. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. This imports FastMCP, the core class for building AI-callable tool servers with built-in OAuth protection. In this minimal example, authentication automatically configures from environment variables for development convenience, but production deployments require explicit provider setup, either WorkOS provider, client ID equals, client secret equals, Authkit domain equals, or Auth0 provider, config URL equals, audience equals, with required scopes and base URL parameters for proper OAuth flow handling. The class maintains clean separation. Tool registration via FastMCP tool stays unchanged, while authentication policies are enforced at the server level, with token management differing between development, ephemeral, and production, persistent storage environments. Version 2.13.0 introduced these production-grade configuration features. Hash authentication, automatically configured from environment. MCP equals FastMCP, name equals my server. This initializes the FastMCP server using development mode authentication, where OAuth credentials are automatically loaded from environment variables. The name parameter sets a server identifier for logging and monitoring, but in production, you must explicitly configure an OAuth provider with required parameters. For production deployments, you would replace this with either WorkOS provider, requiring cliented, client secret, authkit domain, or Auth0 provider, requiring config URL, audience, and base URL, along with required scopes and proper token storage configuration. At MCP, tool. Def protected tool, data, SDR. This tool is now protected by OAuth. The @MCP tool decorator registers this function as an A-accessible endpoint with built-in OAuth protection. In this minimal example, authentication uses environment variables for development convenience, but production requires explicit provider configuration like WorkOS provider, client ID equals, client secret equals, authkit domain equals, or Auth0 provider, config URL equals, audience equals, with required scopes and base URL parameters. This pattern separates tool implementation from security configuration, letting you define endpoints cleanly while enforcing authentication at the server level. Version 2.13.0 introduced these production-grade features with proper token management and provider-specific testing procedures. Return F processed data. This formats the tool's response using an F string, embedding the processed input in a standardized output structure. The pattern ensures consistent response formatting across all tool calls while keeping the business logic cleanly separated from presentation concerns. In FastMCP, tools focus on processing, while the server handles authentication and transport details through configured providers. If name equals main. This standard Python entry point guard prevents accidental server execution during module imports. In development, FastMCP automatically configures authentication from environment variables for convenience, but production deployments require explicit OAuth provider setup with WorkOS provider or Auth0 provider, each needing mandatory parameters like cliented, client secret, and base URL for proper redirect handling. Without this guard, importing the module would immediately launch the HTTP server on port 8000, defeating modular reuse. MCP, run transport equals HTTP, port equals 8000. This starts the FastMCP server on port 8000 using HTTP transport, making all @MCP tool-decorated functions available as protected endpoints. The minimal example uses environment variables for authentication, convenient for development but insufficient for production, which requires explicit provider configuration like WorkOS provider with mandatory cliented, client secret, and authkit domain parameters, or Auth0 provider with required config URL and audience. Production setups also demand base URL for OAuth redirects and required scopes for granular access control, as introduced in version 2.13.0. FastMCP authentication patterns. The @MCP tool decorator exposes Python functions as AI callable endpoints while maintaining complete independence from authentication logic, which is configured at the server level through explicit provider classes. Environment variables simplify development authentication, but production requires explicit providers like WorkOS provider with required parameters including cliented, client secret, authkit domain, and base URL, or Auth0 provider with config URL, cliented, client secret, and audience. Version 2.13.0 introduced persistent token management for production deployments, requiring proper base URL configuration for OAuth redirect handling.
The endpoint that never asks, "Who are you?" still knows exactly who's calling.